So this week we're discussing the next assignment in our sequence of assignments, and that's going to be an annotated bibliography. In this video, I'll go over what an annotated bibliography is and how it will look when you turn it in for this class. So an annotated bibliography is a useful document because it keeps annotations or information or notes on all of your sources that you're doing research on. It helps you in a number of ways. One, it helps you break out of that habit of doing research at the last minute when you actually need to write the paper. With this kind of scaffolded assignment, it helps you get that research done and process it and think about it before you begin writing. And that's an important part about writing a longer essay. Two, it also helps you keep notes on your source and track your changes in your thoughts on your topic. And thirdly, it helps you avoid plagiarism. Because you can use an annotated bibliography to write your research paper, use those notes, you don't have to actually consult the original source again. And this prevents that temptation of wanting to use the exact words of your source, of overquoting or perhaps quoting a source without putting it in quotation marks, problems you can run into with plagiarism. So an annotated bibliography is a useful assignment. You'll probably use it in other classes where you have long research projects. So for this annotated bibliography, I want it to be cited in APA, and I have a longer video, a longer lecture about how we can use APA generally. But I'm just going to go over what that will look like for our annotated bibliography. In APA, we always have a title page, so you'll want to give your annotated bibliography a title here based on your topic. In APA papers, we generally have an abstract. For this abstract, I want you to do something a little bit different for this annotated bibliography. Usually an abstract is just a summary of what your paper is about for an audience, so they don't have to read the whole thing. For this abstract, I want you to focus a little bit more on kind of summarizing and synthesizing what the diverse entries in your annotated bibliography say. So in this abstract, you should, one, identify your research question that's guiding this annotated bibliography. Two, you'll want to capture what you've learned through doing this research. And third, you'll want to identify any major trends or patterns you see in the research. So an abstract is usually only 150 to 250 words. For an assignment like this, it can be slightly longer. And then in an annotated bibliography, your references page and your main body of your paper are smushed together. So I'll begin my annotated bibliography on page 3 by giving the title of my annotated bibliography again, centered and bolded. I will then go ahead and I will put entries in for every source that I have. And I'll put these in order again of being alphabetized. So I'll go ahead first and give the annotation for my source. And I'll do the same format as I would on a reference page, where the first line is far left and any lines afterward are indented. But after I give the entry, I will enter in another space and I will write an annotation or some notes on that source. And in that annotation, I should have, first and foremost, a summary of that source. And that summary should be comprehensive and focused. So I should give an overall sense of what the main argument is in that source, the main ideas, and important supporting points. But I can kind of pick and choose what supporting points I want to highlight based on what I ultimately want to use this source for in my paper, or what I think is the most important. So keep that in mind. It's a delicate balancing act between the two. In the rest of the annotation, besides summary, I want to see you do a combination of analysis, evaluation, and reflection. And I'll go over quickly some questions you can answer to get to this point in your annotation. So besides summary of a source, you want to respond to that source through analysis, evaluation, and reflection. And here's some things you can consider as you write that part of the annotation. One, you can analyze it. So if a summary is saying, what does this source say? An analysis is saying, how did this source make its argument? What are some of its rhetorical features? So you might consider whether the source uses the rhetorical appeals and how it uses them. Do you see ethos, pathos, and logos in here? And if so, how are they using it? What's the most prominent rhetorical appeal they're using? What types of evidence do they tend to use? What unique position does the author of this have on this topic? You might also consider who is the real audience of this piece and how does that affect the argument? You might also consider adding in some evaluation of the source. An evaluation is just saying, is this source worthwhile or not? And what critiques or flaws do we have with it? So ask yourself first and foremost, is this source credible? And if a source is entirely uncredible, if it's not trustworthy at all, if it gives us misinformation, don't include it on your annotated bibliography at all. Remember, this is supposed to serve your research paper, and in your research paper, you're positioning yourself as an expert on this topic among other experts. So you don't want to undercut your own credibility by engaging with sources that are basically just lies. So if the answer to is this credible, it's not credible at all, then don't include it on your annotated bibliography. That said, there might be some flaws in sources, but that doesn't mean they aren't worth engaging with or using in our research. So if that's the case, it's worthwhile just to note what some of the flaws are, even if they don't entirely mean that that source is not usable. So what elements are missing from this argument? Is there focus on one area at the exclusion of another? We're learning this week about fallacies of argument, so some kind of rhetorical flaws that can happen. And so, are there any fallacies of argument in this piece? And if so, what's the effect of it? Just because there's a fallacy of argument doesn't mean we have to throw it out entirely. We just have to acknowledge that it's there. Finally, we might ask ourselves, is this source biased? In some ways, all sources are biased because they come from a particular subject position of the author. However, some sources are more biased than others. Some readily admit their biases and others conceal them. So it's enough to kind of evaluate where their biases are and just acknowledge that they exist. Again, it doesn't mean that the source is not usable at all, but just it's worth acknowledging so you have something to argue with when you write your own research paper. And thinking about that, another component you can include in your annotation is just reflection. And this is an opportunity for you to articulate how this source is going to be useful for your research paper. So thinking ahead, more future focused. And you might answer some questions such as, how did the source prompt you to think differently about your topic? And also, how can you use this source in your research project? So summary, analysis, evaluation, and reflection are all things that should go in that entry for the annotated bibliography.